How did so few men conquer so many? The question is actually, how did so few Spaniards conquer so many indigenous people? And that is a very good question, because when you think about it, Cortes had maybe 300 soldiers as he crossed Mexico, or was to become Mexico, headed for Tenochtitlan, and Pizarro had even less soldiers with him. He was less efficient than Cortes, but just as successful. The numbers of Spaniards at the very early conquest simply don't match the overwhelming number of indigenous people. So how did so few conquer so many? This next picture gives you a sense of that. I wonder if you can pick out from this cartoonish drawing that was obviously not drawn at the time of the conquest, what these elements might be. It's the technological superiority that really made a big difference. The Spaniards had guns made of hard metals and gunpowder. This is not something that the indigenous people had ever seen or used. Their metals were soft, silver and gold are completely ineffective as weapons, and they didn't have gunpowder. And if you've never heard the shot of a gun or seen its destructiveness, being confronted with it for the first time is quite a thing. Additionally, the Spaniards wore armor, coats of armor. We've seen them in earlier pictures of Cortes. These would be completely foreign to indigenous people. It would have been quite impressive to see a human being dressed that way. But technological superiority is not the only thing. It contributed significantly to their loss against the Spaniards. But germs were probably even more destructive. The indigenous people had never been exposed to the kind of diseases that the Spaniards had been made almost, completely immune to after centuries worth of destructive smallpox and plagues in Europe. These were plagues that the indigenous people had never been exposed to. When the Spaniards arrived, most of the indigenous people of the Americas were felled. The epidemics of smallpox were extremely destructive, and if people didn't die of them, they were weakened. And those that survived in much smaller communities. And so they might not have been physically weakened personally, but their communities were weakened and therefore much more vulnerable to overthrow by conquering armies of Spaniards. And ultimately, it's the divisions among the indigenous people that led to their overthrow as well. One of the myths we spoke about was this notion that indigenous people were united against the Spaniards. They weren't. The indigenous people were, in fact, a collection of very varied and diverse indigenous people, nations, tribes. And so the relationship between the Spaniards and these different tribes to strengthen them against their imperial rulers, as they did against against the Aztecs and the Inca, would ultimately be much more effective than any overt war. So yes, the germs, the diseases weakened indigenous communities, and the horses and guns were very impressive and certainly made indigenous people more vulnerable. But it's the fractious relationship amongst indigenous people and their willing alliance with Spaniards against their oppressive rulers that contributed significantly to the overthrow of the Inca Empire and the Aztec Empire. And so when we think about the conquest of the Americas, we often think about Spaniards laying waste to the entire territory, when in fact they were making productive alliances with people that they would ultimately also, in a sense, become rulers over. But it's a much more complicated and dynamic relationship than simply the Spaniards mowing over an entire territory. So ultimately, the reason why so few people conquered so many is because the few were actually united. The Spaniards were united. And the many, well, they weren't. It's our mistake and assumption that this was a large group of indigenous people, we should think about them as many smaller groups that were indigenous, perhaps, to that territory, but who certainly did not see each other as members of the same group. And so colonial Latin America, the product of this contact and this conquest and these alliances, develops as a very diverse hybrid culture that is a mix of both European and many different indigenous influences.